One case
Two interpretations.
and one question.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. Welcome to Two of a Crime. Let me tell you this story first. Before they were in the headlines, they were a family living in Colorado. Shanann Watts, Chris Watts, and their daughters, Bella and Cece. They were 15 weeks pregnant with their son, Nico. Shanann had a very big social media presence, so she was really big into the online stuff. She appeared to be this very vibrant, lively woman. I could see how she would have loved TikTok. She really enjoyed jumping on a video, chatting, putting things out there. So to everybody, this family seemed to just be a family that frequently was sharing moments, life milestones. In the months leading up to August 2018, the Watts' marriage was experiencing significant strain. The family was facing financial pressures, and while Shanann was out of town on a business trip, Chris began an affair with a coworker. Shanann noticed a growing emotional distance between them and expressed concerns about the state of their relationship in conversations with friends and in messages to Chris. The couple had also begun discussing the possibility of separation or divorce. By August 2018, it was clear that their marriage was under enormous stress. After returning home from a business trip to Arizona around 1:48 a.m. on August 13, 2018, Shanann missed a scheduled OB appointment later that morning, something that immediately alarmed her close friend Nicole Atkins. Unable to reach Shanann, Nicole refused to dismiss the silence, going to the Watts' home, repeatedly trying to make contact and ultimately advocating for police to do a welfare check. Inside the home, Shanann's purse, phone, medication, car, and even her wedding ring were still all there. But Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were gone. In a matter of hours, what began as concern from a determined friend had become the beginning of one of the most closely watched missing persons investigations in recent history. Now, we know the story, but investigators don't solve cases by reading a story. They solve them by building a timeline. Every phone call, every surveillance video, every text message, and every minute can matter. Because before you can determine what happened beyond a reasonable doubt, you have to know exactly what happened first. So, on August 13th, 2018, 1:48 a.m., Shanann returns home. She then misses an OB appointment the next morning. Her friend Nicole Atkins becomes concerned. Multiple calls and texts were going back and forth. She finally goes to the Watts home and then requests a welfare check. They found the purse, phone, medication, the vehicle still there, the wedding ring, but Shanann, Bella, Celeste were all gone. So again, August 13th, 2018, Shanann returns home around 1:48 a.m. She misses an OB appointment. Nicole Atkins requests a welfare check. Chris gives his first statements. August 15th, Chris gives television interview, does a polygraph exam. On the 16th, Shanann, Bella, and Celeste are recovered. Shanann had been on a business trip in Arizona. Her flight was delayed and she didn't arrive home until around 1:48 a.m. The last known sighting was on the neighbor's surveillance cam, and later this becomes incredibly important when discussing the time of death. So, Nicole Atkins, this friend, she noticed that Shanann missed her OB appointment. She repeatedly called and texted her. She goes to the house. She refuses to leave. She calls Chris. She calls the police. But without Nicole, we don't really know how long it would have been before anyone realized that Shanann and the girls were missing. That persistence really accelerated everything in this case. During this welfare check, they go inside the house and find again the purse, cell phone, medications that you would have taken with you. No one's leaving without their car, wedding ring. So everything says she intended to come back, except she isn't there. Neither are Bella or Cece. So this creates this immediate investigative urgency for law enforcement. So then Chris does this voluntary interview to the media. He asks for his family to come home. National media kind of picks it up. Investigators ask him to do a polygraph, and he agrees to do this. After the examination, questions continue. He eventually confesses to killing Shanann. He later admits to responsibility for Bella and Cece. So investigators go out and they investigate this site that he was actually assigned to work at. Shanann is found buried nearby. Bella and Celeste are recovered from separate oil tanks. So the search officially becomes a homicide investigation at this point, and it's supported by physical evidence. And we'll get into that. So essentially, now we're saying we've got a polygraph, the body's been recovered, he's confessed, and we go through this series of things that you see. So our question kind of becomes, how much of this case comes directly from evidence and how much comes from connecting the dots? So let's talk about the home and the welfare check. When officers entered the Watts home, they weren't looking for evidence of a homicide. They were conducting a welfare check on a pregnant woman and her two young daughters who couldn't be reached. What they found inside immediately raised questions. Inside the home, investigators found Shanann's purse, cell phone, medication, and vehicle. Her wedding ring was also found inside, along with children's belongings. Individually, none of these things proved a crime had occurred, but together they painted a very different picture. One of the most important principles in forensic investigation is that evidence is often cumulative. A single fact may mean very little on its own, but when multiple independent facts point in the same direction, investigators begin forming and testing these reasonable hypotheses. So, evidence is cumulative, and investigators are asking things like what is present, what is missing, does it fit the overall picture that they are painting? So then you have this surveillance footage. You'll see a lot, and we'll try to post it this week, but you'll see a lot of this like body footage, surveillance footage, pictures, stuff like that. And it really becomes a main part of the evidence for investigators. It becomes a centerpiece. So in this surveillance footage, you can see Chris backing his truck into the driveway. There's just loading activity going on. Investigators are observing Chris while watching this footage. And as part of the investigation, detectives reviewed the footage from security camera belonging to the Watts' next door neighbor, Nate. The camera captured activity in the early morning hours of August 13th and quickly became an important piece of the timeline investigators were building. So in the footage, you can see Chris backing his truck up into the driveway before leaving for work. Investigators also observed periods of loading activity near the truck. While the camera's views were limited, the video provided investigators with the objective timestamps that could be compared with other evidence. They also observed Chris as he watched it. Throughout the review of this footage, detectives continued asking questions, comparing what they were seeing on the screen with text, Chris's explanations, and with the growing body of evidence. So, surveillance footage doesn't always tell investigators exactly what happened. Instead, it provides an objective record of time and movement that can be compared with witness statements, digital evidence, and physical evidence. So, one of the most valuable tools in modern investigation isn't a fingerprint or DNA profile, it's digital evidence. By 2018, our phones and electronic devices were constantly creating records that investigators could use to reconstruct what happened. Investigators examined phone records, text messages, call logs, and activity timestamps from multiple devices. They also reviewed Shanann's communication with friends, Chris's communication with his girlfriend, and other digital records to establish when conversations occurred and how relationships were changing. Digital evidence doesn't usually tell investigators exactly what happened. Instead, it helps answer questions like who communicated when and from where. Combined with surveillance footage, GPS data, and witness statements, those digital records become part of a much larger investigative picture. So, in this case, the digital evidence wasn't about finding one smoking gun, if you will. It was about independently verifying the sequence of events. One misconception about digital evidence is that it catches people committing crimes. More often, it helps investigators determine when something happened, where someone was, or whether a different piece of evidence supports or contradicts another. So, next is cell phone data. Modern cell phones create an extraordinary amount of information. Investigators can analyze location data, calls, messages, and device activity to help reconstruct a person's movement and communications over time. In this case, investigators compared phone activity from multiple devices with surveillance footage, GPS records, and witness statements. Rather than relying on a single source, they used records to determine when phones were active, where they were located, and how those details fit into the larger timeline. Every call, text message, device interaction leaves behind a digital footprint. While no single record tells us the entire story, investigators can compare thousands of data points to identify patterns, verify timelines, and determine whether different pieces of evidence are consistent with one another. So, cell phone data doesn't explain someone's intentions, it documents activity. Investigators use that information to test statements against objective records and to reconstruct events as accurately as possible. Now I'm going to lead into vehicle and GPS evidence. So, this corroborated the movements independently of statements. Investigators also relied on objective vehicle data to reconstruct Chris's movements on the morning of August 13th. His company work truck generated GPS and work related records that documented where the vehicle traveled and when. Those records showed that Chris traveled to the 319 oil site, one of the locations that was actually assigned to him for work that morning. Investigators compared the truck's arrival and departure times with surveillance footage, phone activity, and other related evidence to build a detailed timeline of events. GPS records don't explain why someone went somewhere, but they can independently confirm where a vehicle traveled and when. In this case, those records helped investigators corroborate movements using objective data rather than relying solely on witness statements or interviews. One of the strongest forms of evidence is evidence that can be independently verified. GPS records, work logs, surveillance footage, and digital data don't replace an investigation, they strengthen it by allowing investigators to compare multiple sources of information. So, normally I would have called this behavioral evidence, but I'm going to call it investigative observations. So, behavior isn't forensic proof, it's what guides investigators towards additional evidence. One of the first things investigators evaluate isn't physical evidence, it's people. Throughout a case, detectives observe conversations, interactions, responses, not because behavior proves guilt, but because it helps determine what next questions to ask. In this case, investigators observed Chris during the welfare check, while reviewing surveillance footage, during televised interviews, and throughout multiple conversations with detectives. As investigation progressed, they also documented statements that appeared inconsistent with other information that they had collected. It's important to understand that behavior is not a forensic proof. People respond to stress, grief, trauma, police questioning in different ways. Investigators don't use behavior to determine guilt, they use it to identify inconsistencies, develop leads, and decide what evidence needs to be verified. One of the biggest misconceptions in true crime is that investigators solve cases by reading body language. In reality, behavior is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. We talked about that a lot with Casey Anthony. Those 31 days in between where she was just acting like nothing had happened and she had not reported her daughter missing, that's where a lot of misconception happens because people are thinking that this means she's guilty, but they want you to know that that's not necessarily true. So you're kind of watching this body language and you're saying, okay, how are they acting? But again, that's where we're talking about interpretation, right? Of course she's guilty. Why would she act that way? Why would she do those things? So I think that it's just one more thing that you really need to consider whenever you're looking at things like this. Behavior generates questions, evidence answers them. So let's talk about the polygraph and the interview. The confession alone wasn't enough. As investigators gathered evidence, they asked Chris Watts if he would voluntarily participate in a polygraph examination and a formal interview. The goal wasn't to prove guilt, it was to compare his statements with the evidence investigators had already begun collecting. Following the examination, investigators continued questioning Chris about the events of August 13th. During that interview, he admitted to killing Shanann. As the investigation continued, he later confessed to killing Bella and Celeste as well. Confession is a powerful evidence, but investigators don't simply accept that at face value. They compare it against every statement, physical evidence, digital record, witness account, forensic finding to determine whether the confession is supported by the facts. Investigators are going to ask things like, does the evidence support the confession? Does the timeline fit? Are the details corroborated? One of the biggest misconceptions in criminal investigations is that a confession automatically closes a case. In reality, investigators still have to corroborate what was said using independent evidence. So a confession becomes much stronger when it aligns with the facts. A confession tells investigators what happened. Physical evidence tells investigators what they can use to prove what happened. Okay, let's talk about physical evidence. So there were things such as recovery location, burial sites, oil batteries, autopsy findings, clothing, physical evidence recovered from the scene. This is all evidence that connects a timeline, digital data, and confession to the crime scene. So, as the investigation progressed, detectives searched this site, the oil site, where Chris had traveled that morning. There, investigators recovered the bodies of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, transforming the case from a missing persons investigation to a homicide investigation supported by physical evidence. Investigators documented the burial sites, the oil storage tanks, clothing, and other physical evidence recovered from the scene. Each item was carefully photographed, collected, and analyzed before being compared with the timeline investigators had already constructed. Forensic pathologists performed autopsies to determine the causes and manners of death and to document injuries and other medical findings. Those conclusions became other independent sources of evidence that investigators could compare with witness statements, digital records, and Chris's admissions of guilt. So, physical evidence is often considered the foundation of a criminal investigation because it exists independently of memory, opinion, perception. Investigators use it to test whether the timeline, digital evidence, and witness statements all point to the same conclusions. But even when investigators collect the same evidence, people don't always reach the same conclusions. So, where does evidence end and interpretation begin? And that's the question that we're always asking. So, throughout this episode, we've looked at surveillance footage, phone records, GPS data, interviews, physical evidence, and a confession. But here's a question we think every true crime listener should ask: what does evidence actually prove? And just as importantly, where does the interpretation begin? We've walked through the story, the timeline, the evidence, but here's where forensic investigations become fascinating. Evidence doesn't speak for itself, it has to be interpreted. That doesn't mean that investigators guess. It means that they ask an important question over and over again. What does this evidence actually tell us? So let's start with behavior. Chris appeared calm during interviews and television appearances. Many people interpreted that as deception, but behavior alone cannot establish guilt. People respond to stress, trauma, and police investigation differently. Behaviors may raise questions, but investigators still have to answer those questions with evidence. So surveillance is next. The neighbor's surveillance footage, the camera shows Chris backing his truck in the driveway, but does the video actually show a crime? No, it documents movements and timing. Investigators then compare that footage with everything else collected, and they continue. Vehicle GPS placed Chris' work truck at the 319 oil site, but GPS doesn't always explain someone went somewhere. It tells the investigators where, not what happened after they got there. And then the polygraph. Chris also agreed to take a polygraph exam. Many people assume failing a polygraph proves guilt, but it doesn't. In this case, the examination became part of the investigative process and led to further questioning, but investigators still had to support their conclusions with independent evidence. So, confession. Chris eventually confessed. That seems like the end of the investigation, but it wasn't. Investigators compared his statements to the autopsies, GPS records, digital evidence, physical evidence, and timelines. A confession is important. Corroboration is essential. Okay, the very last thing, finally, physical evidence. The recovery locations, autopsy findings, clothing, and evidence collected from the scene. Unlike witness memories or opinions, physical evidence can be often scientifically examined. And that's what investigators use to determine whether the timeline, digital evidence, and confession all supported the same conclusion. So I want to talk about observation, evidence, interpretation. Observation, what investigators see or document, so the truck backed into a driveway. Evidence, the objective fact established by that observation, the truck was in the driveway at a specific time. And then interpretation, the conclusion or inferences drawn from what the evidence is, what someone may have been doing. That's what we mean by the forensic interpretation gap. Every investigation begins with evidence, but every piece of evidence raises another question. Surveillance footage tells us what a camera captured, but not necessarily what was happening. GPS tells us where someone went, not why they went there. Phone records tell us that communication occurred, not what someone intended. Behavior may raise suspicion, but it doesn't establish guilt, even a confession that has been tested against evidence. So, in this case, multiple independent lines of evidence ultimately pointed investigators to the same conclusion. But understanding why they reached that conclusion requires more than hearing a story. It requires understanding what each piece of evidence actually contributes. That's the difference between hearing a case and investigating one. And that's where the forensic interpretation gap begins. Okay, the one final thing that I want to do is I want to change the lens for a minute. So, when most people think about this case, they ask one question: how could someone do that? That's an understandable question, but it's not the question I want to ask. Investigators have to ask the question: how do they prove what happened? So the case wasn't solved because of a confession or some big surveillance video, GPS record, or whatever. It was because dozens and dozens of pieces of independent information all pointed towards the same conclusion. So digital evidence, GPS surveillance, physical evidence, witnesses, timelines, confessions. So when you change the lens from did he do it to how do investigators know, The investigation becomes far more educational than sensational. So, this case reminds us that a good investigation isn't built on one dramatic moment. He confessed. That's great, but it's built on very careful documentation, independent evidence, scientific analysis, willingness to test every conclusion. So sometimes changing the lens doesn't change the outcome, it just changes your understanding of how investigators got to that conclusion.